Typically, apocalypse movies promise the end of the world as spectacle. These 7 films promise something smaller, but far more disturbing. Not what happens when the world ends, but what the end does to you. 7 films, 7 psychological mechanisms. Let's begin.
There is a storm coming! Like nothing you have ever seen! And not a one of you is prepared for it!
Take Shelter, 2011. In 2011, Jeff Nichols made a film nobody could quite categorize. Not a disaster movie, not a horror film. Something more precise and more personally unsettling than either. Curtis LaForge is a blue-collar worker in rural Ohio. Good marriage, young daughter, stable life, and then the dreams begin. Dark clouds moving like living things, rain that feels like motor oil, the people he loves turning on him with animal violence. He wakes up and eventually starts expanding and reinforcing the old storm shelter in his backyard. Here's the uncomfortable thing Take Shelter does to you as a viewer. You believe him. Not because the film gives you evidence, because something in you recognizes the feeling. Psychologists call it anticipatory anxiety, the mind's compulsion to generate worst-case futures, not as a malfunction, but as a survival strategy. Your brain runs disaster simulations constantly, below the threshold of conscious thought. Most of them never surface. But under sustained pressure, financial, relational, existential, the simulations break through. They feel like premonitions. They feel like clarity. They feel like you are finally seeing what everyone else is too comfortable to see. Whether Curtis is delusional is beside the point. He's doing something every human brain does. He's just doing it loudly, visibly, without the social filters that keep the rest of us from acting on it. The storm shelter he builds is insane. It is also exactly what you would build if you stopped suppressing what your mind has been quietly telling you for years. Until the very final seconds, the film leaves you in that heavy ambiguity. By the end, the more disturbing question is how long you've been building your own shelter and what you've been calling it instead. Pulse, 2001. Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Pulse opens with a question nobody asks out loud. What if the thing that was killing people was something they already had? Tokyo, early 2000s. People are vanishing, not violently, not dramatically. They're leaving dark stains on walls where they used to stand. And the ones who remain don't flee or fight. They sit down, they go quiet, they stop wanting anything at all. Kurosawa never explains the mechanism. The internet is involved, ghosts are involved, but the film's actual subject has nothing to do with either. What Pulse documents, with the precision of a slow-moving case study, is the process by which a person becomes unreachable. Not through trauma or catastrophe, through accumulation. The small daily failures of contact, the conversations that don't quite land, the rooms people share without actually meeting inside them. Neuroscientific research on chronic social isolation shows that the brain under these conditions begins to register the world as fundamentally threatening. Hypervigilance increases, the capacity for trust erodes, and withdrawal becomes self-reinforcing. The ghost in Pulse is the clinical endpoint of that process. Kurosawa has built something that feels less like a nightmare and more like a slow-motion documentation of a process already underway. In ordinary apartments, in ordinary cities, among people who are technically present but genuinely unreachable. The film ends without confrontation, just absence, spreading at the rate of daily life. Last Night, 1998. Don McKellar's Last Night begins with a fact stated plainly. The world ends tonight at midnight. Everyone knows. There is no debate, no last-minute salvation, no point in the film where this is questioned. The end is scheduled. What McKellar is interested in is the 12 hours before. Toronto. One night, a man has dinner with his family. Someone else works through his list of sexual experiences he always meant to have. A gas company employee calls customers to assure them their service will remain uninterrupted until the very end. People make plans. People keep appointments. People behave with remarkable consistency as though tomorrow will still come. Psychologists studying end-of-life behavior and extreme crisis situations have documented what happens when the mind confronts an event too large to metabolize. Faced with something genuinely unprocessable, an enormity with no cognitive framework to contain it, the brain doesn't collapse. It retreats to the most deeply grooved behavioral patterns it has. The familiar becomes load-bearing. Rituals that seemed arbitrary reveal themselves as the actual structure holding the self together. The characters in Last Night aren't in denial. They know exactly what's coming. They're doing the only thing the brain knows how to do when it reaches the edge of what it can hold, filling the remaining hours with the texture of ordinary life, because without that texture, there is nothing to be. How much of what you do every day exists not because you chose it, but because your mind requires it, to avoid confronting what last night's characters can no longer avoid.
Look, I haven't got time to talk to you. I'm a very busy man. Besides, you've had your
The Quiet Earth, 1985. Jeff Murphy's The Quiet Earth begins with a man waking up alone, not metaphorically, literally. He walks outside, drives through the city, turns on the radio. There is no one. Every person on Earth has vanished overnight, and Zach Hobson is, as far as he can tell, the only human being left alive. Most films would treat this as a survival story. Murphy treats it as a psychological experiment. Within days, Zach begins to deteriorate, not physically, but structurally. He moves into a luxury mansion. He puts on women's clothes and delivers grand speeches to cardboard cutouts of historical figures. He declares himself president of the world in an empty room. He fires a shotgun in a manic, blasphemous rage. The self, as contemporary psychology understands it, has no fixed core. It is constructed and maintained continuously through contact with other people. We know who we are because others reflect it back to us. Remove that reflection entirely, and the self doesn't persist. It begins to perform, then fragment, then dissolve. Zach doesn't go mad because he's weak. He goes mad because the conditions that make a coherent self possible have been systematically removed. When other survivors eventually appear, his recovery is immediate, not because his circumstances improve, but because he becomes real again in the only way the human mind truly can, through being seen.
James! I'm gonna watch you until I can't see you anymore. Can you watch me too? Until you can't see me?
Sure.
These Final Hours, 2013. Zach Hilditch's These Final Hours opens with the end already decided. An unstoppable firestorm is moving across the earth, consuming everything. Australia has hours left. The exact time of death is known. There is nowhere to go. James has a plan for his last hours. A party, music, drugs, alcohol, bodies. The loudest possible noise between himself and what's coming. He leaves his pregnant girlfriend behind in her beach house, choosing to drive toward a hedonistic end-of-the-world celebration. But on his way, he stops when he witnesses a young girl being abducted by two desperate men. He intervenes, saves her, and finds himself responsible for her safety. The film has no interest in redemption. It has interest in something more specific. What happens to the brain when the usual architecture of motivation, career, reputation, future consequences, is completely removed? Terror management theory, developed by psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pischinsky, proposes that most human behavior is organized, at its foundation, around the suppression of death awareness. We build careers, relationships, legacies, elaborate symbolic structures designed to generate the feeling of permanence in the face of biological mortality. Strip away the future entirely and those structures collapse. James protects the girl with no future left to protect. The mind, stripped of strategy, falls back on something older. The instinct toward connection, toward meaning in the immediate moment, toward being, in the last hours, the person you actually are, rather than the person circumstances required. These final hours asks what your life would look like if you knew, with certainty, that tomorrow wasn't coming. The answer the film gives is both more honest and more devastating than any answer you'd give yourself today. Threads, 1984. Mick Jackson's Threads was made for British television in 1984. The BBC almost didn't air it. When they did, switchboards were flooded. People reported being unable to sleep. Threads had done something that nuclear war films rarely do. It had refused to be watchable. The film follows two ordinary Sheffield families in the weeks before, during, and after a Soviet nuclear strike on Britain. The first act is almost aggressively mundane. A young couple, a pregnancy, arguments about money. Then the bombs fall. What happens next is not spectacle, it is documentation. Threads tracks the collapse of civilization not as a backdrop, but as the subject. Specifically, the collapse of the psychological infrastructure that civilization provides. Language deteriorates. Within one generation, survivors speak in clipped, functional fragments. Institutional memory dissolves. Children born after the strike have no framework for what came before. The social rituals, the shared references, the accumulated symbolic systems that allow a mind to organize experience, all of it gone, inside a single human lifetime. The mind is not a self-contained unit. It develops within and depends upon a cultural and linguistic environment. Remove that environment, and the mind doesn't revert to some essential pre-cultural self. It contracts. The range of thought available to a person is shaped by the cognitive tools their culture provides. Threads shows with clinical patients what happens when those tools are no longer transmitted. The most disturbing thing about Threads is not the blast. It's the generation that comes after. Children who have inherited survival but not the capacity to understand what was lost, because the language for that understanding no longer exists. You are not a self that exists independently of your culture. You are, in part, a product of everything your civilization taught you to think with. Threads removes that, slowly, irreversibly, and shows you what remains. The Sacrifice, 1986. Andrei Tarkovsky made The Sacrifice in 1986, the year he died. He knew he was dying while he made it. This is not incidental information. Alexander is a former journalist and actor living on a remote Swedish island. On his birthday, a radio announcement confirms what everyone feared. Nuclear war has begun. He makes a deal with God. Everything, his home, his family, his voice, his life, in exchange for the morning returning to normal. The next morning, everything is normal. Terror management research shows that when mortality becomes undeniable, the brain stops reasoning and reaches for ritual, for bargaining, for magical thinking. The vow made in the foxhole. The deal struck with whatever force seems large enough to matter. Across cultures and centuries, the pattern is identical. The mind, at its limit, stops calculating outcomes and starts performing meaning. Tarkovsky films Alexander's bargain with complete seriousness, because the impulse behind it is not irrational. It is the mind's oldest available tool, the one that predates every other system we have built to manage the fact of our own mortality. If it worked, was it madness? 7 films, 7 psychological mechanisms. The apocalypse is the setting. What's actually being tracked is already running inside you, in how you manage fear, identity, and the fact of your own mortality. Thank you for watching.